What you think when you hear the term mental health. Give me a few adjectives that you would think that would describe that.
Functioning in society.
Functioning in society, absolutely. If you're able to function in society, that means you have a base of mental health, for sure. Yeah? Excellent. Ability to cope and meet life's challenges. That's a huge one, because being healthy doesn't necessarily mean being happy. We're not happy all the time. Life isn't easy all the time. The question is when it gets difficult, are we able to cope? Mental illness, by the most simplest definition, is a prolonged change in either your affect or mood, your behavior, or your cognition. And when you think about it, the factors to consider are what intensity of these changes are you observing, what duration, and what frequency. And are they interrupting function in a variety of domains? So are you unable to study? Are you unable to come to class? Are you in the workforce? Are you unable to perform your regular duties as a result of this illness? These are the things that we use to determine the difference between a normal everyday mood or reaction to a trauma in life versus a clinical mental illness. Just 50% of Canadians would even tell friends or colleagues that they have a family member with a mental illness. That's recent. That's a statistic that is relatively current and accurate. And how depressing is that? And I use that word intentionally. Think about it. What other illness can you say that about? Can you say that about cancer? Somebody gets breast cancer that you know, would they be afraid to tell anybody? On any given week, at least 500,000 employees are unable to work due to mental illness. It's drastically affecting our workforce, and 21% on that point of the working age population live with a mental illness. 21%. That's a huge number. And if we don't understand it or understand how to handle it, it won't get better. We won't improve. And that's why talks like this are, I think, important, and I hope people like you are going to help make that difference as time goes on. In 2011, prevalence peaked at 20 to 29 years of age among both males and females. And of course, this is the time when most people are entering the workforce, becoming the most productive. It can stall a lot of careers very early. And if it isn't caught and managed, it can completely derail a professional life. In 2011, among working-aged males, the peak prevalence was 28.9%. And among the same age for females, 28.1. Again, we're talking almost a third of people who are experiencing this. And I think with better treatment and better understanding, this number will reduce because more and more people with minor to moderate mental illnesses will get treatment and recover. And that's what we need to focus on. So, a couple of sentences that I really want to stress, so I'm going to read them, but stigma, or prejudice, which is essentially synonymous, describes a negative and unfavorable attitude. That's the key, is that it is an attitude. It's latent. It's not an action. Having stigma against something is inside you. It's inside your head. It's an opinion. You may have a stigma against something and never share it, never show it, but you feel it. Stigma causes those living with mental illnesses to be labeled, stereotyped, and feared. But what is discrimination? It's the action that results from stigma. That's when you take it that extra step farther. And that's when you say, yeah, my friend, she's been depressed for the last couple of weeks. I think she's lazy. I just don't think she wants to bother. And she's asking me to help her with her studies, and I don't know why I should do that. She's not really trying that hard. That's now discriminating against that person because you have a stigma against the illness and don't believe that it is an illness. You think it's a personality trait. So discrimination denies social participation or human rights to categories of people based on prejudice. This is a very important question. Why do we experience stigma, fear, and judgment with mental illnesses, but not with other illnesses like cancer, epilepsy, or diabetes? Have you ever considered telling somebody who was giving themselves a shot of insulin because they have diabetes, they have diabetes, and saying to them, have you ever thought of trying harder so that you didn't need that insulin? Have you ever thought of just applying yourself in a more, focused way? Like you don't need the insulin, do you? Really? I mean, would you ever do that? And if you did, what would the person beside you say? They would turn to you and be like, what are you talking about? Because every one of us understands that the person taking the insulin is taking it because there is a failure in the biochemistry of their body that needs treatment. And if they don't take the treatment, they will be ill. And if they take it, they will be fine. But people do this all the time when it comes to mental illnesses. The simple truth about stigma, in my opinion, is that if you examine all the illnesses on the planet and then add up the ones that have stigma and the ones that don't, none of the ones that have stigma against them deserve it. None of the ones that have stigma against them should have stigma against them. Stigma is nothing more or less than the result of fear and misunderstanding, or judgment, because we are not able to conceive of how that person got to that place. But often judgment comes from fear. If a person looks at another person and thinks, oh my God, they have something and I don't want that something, that fear can result in a need to disassociate, and that disassociation can result in stigma and in discrimination. Stigma is seen as one of the key barriers preventing people from seeking help. Well, that's an obvious side effect. If I'm afraid of what you all think about me having bipolar, and I'm in this group, I'm one of the students in this group, then maybe I'm not going to say it. But if I'm not afraid of what you think, I'm going to be much more likely to admit it, to talk about it with friends, and to seek help. The topics raised here are that the drugs are a punishment for the illness. That is an attitude that I had certainly at the beginning, and that is based on the stigma and the fear and the negative approach of the illness, rather than viewing it as an illness that I am unfortunate to have, but thankfully there's a treatment that might help it. So that's one side of it, which is the attitude you bring to it. As somebody who has bipolar, I watch movies, I watch television, and I see it referenced frequently. I mean, it's quite a common thing, way more common than it actually is in society. But what bothers me is, and it's understandable, if you're filming a show about a person with bipolar, there's two sides of the illness you can show. There's the depression when they're doing nothing, and then there's the mania when they're doing all kinds of things, which is more interesting to watch. So you're going to do that more. So when you look at Homeland and you ask yourself, what's bipolar? Today, most people who watch that show and don't know much about the illness would assume, oh, it's that illness where you act all crazy, and that's it. They won't really associate it with both sides. So that's why I bring that up there, is that media influences our understanding and our opinions drastically, and it is rarely correct, or if it is correct, it is rarely the whole story. While you are clinically depressed, you will experience depressed mood, obviously. Some people experience irritation or emptiness. For me, when I experienced depression, it was never irritation, it was always the emptiness. It was more the passive kind. A loss of pleasure in normal activities, that certainly applied to me. Change in sleep patterns, usually more is needed, but some people, when they're depressed, they can't sleep. It depends on the individual. For me, it was more sleep. I slept a lot. Change in appetite, weight gain or loss, that's very common. Restlessness or lethargy, again, they're opposites, but everybody experiences this differently. Low self-esteem, feelings of guilt or worthlessness. Recurring thoughts about death, that is a common issue with clinical depression. For me, fortunately, that was not one that I dealt with. And isolation from family and friends, and that is inevitable for anybody who experiences clinical depression, simply because you aren't able to interact in a normal way, so you get shut off from people around you. Bipolar disorder is a disorder where you experience clinical depression that is very similar to what they, in contrast, would call unipolar clinical depression. The only difference is it can sometimes be even more intense. The other thing with bipolar is that, by definition, in order to experience bipolar, you have to also experience the highs. You have to experience hypomania and mania. So the mania comes present with the following, and when I say hypomanic to manic, just think of it as degrees, like turning the volume up from a 5 to an 8 to a 12. So fast speech and thought. If I was hypomanic right now, you might not know the difference. The thing is that I would be speaking faster than I am right now, but it wouldn't be so fast that you would think something was wrong. because there's lots of people who are fast talkers. I'm one of them, actually. This is me trying not to speak fast. So the thing with that is, if you have hypomania, you can socially interact. I lived for months hypomanic without anyone really knowing anything was drastically wrong. They just thought I was an energetic, kind of hyper guy. It can happen. Risk-taking and impulsive behavior happens to degrees when you're hypomanic and can explode when you're manic. There are people for whom mania has destroyed their lives. They have spent all their money on things they didn't want or need. They have cheated on their spouses. They have been exposed or put themselves into situations where they got into fights or were violently, like literally picking a fight with somebody that they couldn't handle in a bar that they shouldn't have been in. You can end up in some horrible situations because your ability to be logical, to make decisions, can go out the window in a manic episode. Unrealistic beliefs about abilities. There is such a thing as a God complex for a manic person. There is a thing of, they start to feel a grandiose sense of their impact on the world, of what they can do, of their ideas. Every idea that a manic person has is brilliant. It is the most revolutionary thing, and it needs to be written down. Reduced need for sleep. That's a drastic one. By reduced, I mean it can be reduced to nil for days, which is destructive, because if any one of you, who I'm going to make the grand assumption that none of you are manic right now, or else you wouldn't be sitting here, if you stopped sleeping right now for 5 days and then went to a doctor and were checked out, there would be a lot wrong with you, because none of us can function well with 5 days of zero sleep. Now imagine being manic and then having 5 days of zero sleep, or 6 or 7. It exacerbates the problem dramatically. There is just the simplest concept. If there's one thing you walk out of here with, it's this. No one should be discriminated against because they are sick. Period. There's no illness on the face of the planet that anyone should experience that they should then have to deal with the discrimination. It's ridiculous when you really think about it. It's a very bizarre behavior that we do. And I think that if you see it that way, it becomes harder and harder to actually do it, or to let somebody else do it in your presence.